Hi there, I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. I've been thrilled with all the stories that listeners have sent to me. I think it's so important that we share inspirational stories with one another. I hope you feel the spirit as you listen to the story today. It's a powerful message. It kind of goes along with the Come Follow Me discussion for this week about the stripling warriors, and it's a wonderful story. I've been shocked at how few of the young people know about the stories of their own ancestors. My wife's family was shocked when I uncovered information about their great-great-grandfather, Henry Bigler. They thought he'd moved to California and gone inactive, when in reality he was one of the very first missionaries sent to Hawaii. He pioneered the work in Hawaii and later became a mission president there and was a very wonderful man. We had one of our relatives to dinner. He was at BYU, a return missionary. He knew nothing about my second and his third great-grandfather. And stories of Mariner Wood Merrill have been in multiple books, and yet he wasn't familiar with any of them. I think it's very important that we share these stories with our children and our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Jake Harmer sent me a story. He has started doing family history storybooks for youth. And today's story is going to be based on one of his books about his second great-grandfather. I loved the book, and I ordered one for my grandchildren for Christmas. So if any of them watch, they'll know what they're going to get. But they're great books, and I put a link to his site in the comments, and he's agreed to give a $50 off coupon to any of the listeners. Just enter Sunshine in the coupon code column. His great-great-grandfather was Lowell Budd Duncombe. This book, The Modern Stripling Warriors, is the book he did about that. Lowell was born the same year as my grandfather. However, he was born in Salt Lake City. And when he was 7 years old, his parents and several other families in the area were attracted to the abundant, fertile land in Alberta, Canada. I guess they hadn't heard about the winters. And they moved up there and began to farm. So Lowell, from the time he was 7 years old, began to understand the importance of hard work in his life. But his life wasn't all work. He had a lot of fun. He began to make friends with the boys in his primary class and go to church and to school with. They got into a little trouble once in a while. One day, he and Archie had to bring a note home from their teacher because they'd been playing stickball on the desk with walnuts and their rulers, and she came and gave them the word, and they had to tell their parents about it. But they had a lot of fun, and soon they were baptized and eventually received the Aaronic priesthood. There were 9 boys in their quorum, and they became very strong friends. They all loved one another. They had a lot of fun. They did things. They rode horses. They did pranks. One year for Halloween, they decided it'd be funny if they moved Brother Salmon's outhouse across town, and they were quite pleased with themselves that night. The next morning, Archie and Lowell got a knock on the door from the town sheriff, and they had to round up the boys and take the outhouse back. But they just did things that were fun. Most of them had horses. Lowell had a horse that was a little unruly and had a tendency to buck and be quite hard to ride. So Lowell became a very good horseman, especially on some of the bucking broncos. And in fact, when he was 16 years old, in 1911, he won $25 at a local rodeo, which in 1911 was a lot of money. So it was a big prize. So he must have been quite proficient at riding. The boys had a lot of fun together. Lowell and several of his friends graduated in 1914, and 2 months after their graduation, Great Britain declared war on Germany, and the Great War, World War I, began. They were horrified as they read of the battles in trenches and of thousands tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of men being killed. They knew that Canada was part of the British Empire, and they discussed the situation, and they were aware that they could very well be called on to serve in the military. A year later, the rest of their quorum graduated, and they were in church on March 15th, 1916. They had all graduated from high school and were just sitting on the back row enjoying the meeting and having fun with one another. Lowell Duncombe, Archie Bennett, Charlie Tufts, Lee Macomber, Henry Price, Lee Miller, Herschel Van Orman, Les Haynes, and Leslie Bigelow. They'd gone all through the Aaronic priesthood quorums together, and now, as Hugh B. Brown spoke, it was pretty hard to ignore him. And all of a sudden, he looked right at those boys, and he told them that he had been charged with recruiting strong young men to serve, to help defend their freedom. And he looked right at them and called them to action. And they quit horsing around, and they looked at him, and they looked at each other. And then Brother Samuel J. Layton got up. He was a general authority. He looked at those young men. He realized that they had felt the call and that they were considering, and they knew of the dangers. The Spirit of the Lord rested on Brother Layton and on those boys, and he promised them in the name of the Lord that if they would not do anything that would embarrass their mothers, that if they would keep the commandments and serve faithfully, that they would all return home safely. Elder Brown and Elder Layton had spoken directly to the young men, and they felt the call. 10 days later, they all enlisted. They were assigned to the 13th Oversea Mounted Rifles Division. They worked hard in their basic training. They worked with horses. They were a cavalry division, and they soon learned that not all the soldiers shared the standards of conduct that they believed they needed to do. The boys became closer together as they united in trying to keep the commandments and stay faithful. They studied the scriptures together. They knelt in their tent and prayed together at night and pleaded with the Lord to help them. Within 8 months, 8 of the 9 boys from Taber, Alberta, were sent overseas to London. When they were on leave, the boys were allowed to participate with the London mission. They said they were given true American hospitality by the missionaries and the mission president and the members of the church in London. They enjoyed participating with the members in activities and in worship services, and soon the boys were closer than ever, because most of the soldiers, when they were on leave, did not have religious inclination. One day in a district conference, the apostle David O. McKay spoke, and he had heard of Elder Layton's promise to these boys from Taber. And he looked at them and he said this out of this great book: I promise you, boys, in the name of the Lord, that if you will continue faithful to the commandments of the Lord, avoid the vices and sins of the world, and keep the word of wisdom, you will all come back and be preserved to fulfill a life's work. They again felt the spirit of this promise, but still the pressure and the horror of the situation they were in continued to mount. Men would come back from the front and they'd say, you may as well start smoking now, because when you have to stand all night in icy mud up to your waist, you'll be glad to have a smoke or two. Then they'd say, we would march all day without a thing to eat or drink, and when we finally made camp, the only thing we had was a little tea. You may as well drink tea now, boys, because you're going to have to drink it eventually. When you're under heavy machine gun fire in a trench and you're commanded to go out into no man's land, you'll want to brace yourself with a little rum or brandy. But the boys continued to unite and stay close together. They held true to their values. As Lowell attended church services, a young lady caught his eye, and he began to be friendly with her. She was a beautiful young lady named Nellie. He had dinner with their family several times, and they were falling in love. 3 weeks before Lowell was shipped to the front lines in France, he and Nellie were married. They were terrified of the accounts that were given in the papers every day. Hundreds of thousands of British soldiers were dying, and it was a horrifying thought. They clung to their love and to their faith as Lowell was shipped out. 4 of the Tabor boys had stayed together. They were now trained soldiers in the cavalry, and they were called upon into heavy action. One day they had marched all day. When they made camp, the only thing available to them to drink, after having nothing to drink all day or eat, was a little tea. After that, whenever there was a time of plenty, they would store up a few rations. They soon found that the other soldiers were very eager to trade their cigarettes, their tea, and their rum for more staple, nourishing products like jam and crackers. And so they kept a store with them as they marched. Before the Battle of Cambrai, Lowell was taken very sick and was shipped back to one of the military hospitals. At that battle, as Archie was riding his horse across a rickety bridge, the bridge gave way, the horse tipped over with him on its back, took out the whole side of the bridge and fell into the river. Even though he was under a heavy load with ammunition and his rifle and his other weapons, was able to struggle to shore. Then he was able to secure his horse and retrieve him and get him to shore. But by the time he crawled out of the river and got things put back together, his division had charged into heavy fire. An hour later, he said, "Where's the B squadron?" They told him, "There are no survivors of B Squadron." 2 of his friends were in that group. Later that night, Charlie Tufts returned. To his dismay, Les Bigelow never returned. He wondered, was the apostles' promise real? Was that really from the Lord? I had felt the Spirit. How did we lose Les? They were frequently ordered into heavy fire situations. After Lowell rejoined the group, a brigadier general commanded their squadron to charge in open daylight towards a heavily wooded area that was manned by multiple machine guns. Their colonel objected, and he said, "All my men will be killed." And the general heartlessly said, "Charge those woods. I don't give a damn if one of your men make it back." And as they charged, Lowell's horse was shot out from under him, and he was able to take cover. Almost every horse in the company was shot dead, and they were able to advance in the trenches toward the machine gun fire and capture the woods. In another attack, live artillery was exploding all around. They were under heavy artillery fire as they advanced through no man's land. One artillery shell hit right between Archie's feet. It was a dud. It didn't explode. In that same battle, Charlie Tufts was hit in the hand by one of the artillery round shrapnel that had exploded, and Lee McComber was shot through the ankle. They were both evacuated to field hospitals and returned to duty as soon as they were able. They continued to fight. They continued to heed the promise of the Lord's apostles. And through those battles, through that horror, they clung to their faith, and they felt they were truly protected by the Lord. One day, as they were charging up a hill, Archie and Charlie were carrying a heavy box of machine gun ammunition between them up the hill. It was hit by machine gun fire and blasted out of their hands, and miraculously, none of the rounds exploded. The box was just disintegrated And miracle after miracle preserved these young men. One day, Archie was given the command that he and a column was to advance through a heavily wooded area. He was the third man in line. He said the trees were being blasted into splinters by machine gun fire from the airplanes above and from the machine guns ahead of them that they were charging. He said the trees were just exploding with artillery and gunfire. And the two men in front of him, one at a time, both dropped dead. Men around him and behind him were all killed. And miraculously, he was able to survive. After that battle, the men returned back to their camp in the evening. Their comrades had made a big meal for them, but only 6 men returned out of a whole company of men. None of them felt like eating that night. The battles continued. The men clung to their faith, and Armistice found 7 of the 8 chasing the Germans through Belgium as they retreated and surrendered. The 7 Tabor boys were transferred back to London, and shortly after their arrival they were thrilled to see a picture from the Friedrichsfeld-Buissel prison camp. And there, standing amongst the prisoners, was their friend from Tabor, Leslie Bigelow. He had survived the war in a prison camp. Lowell was reunited with his bride, Nellie. The men and Nellie were able to make their way back to Tabor, Alberta. The promise of the Lord's apostle and representatives that had been confirmed to the hearts of those 9 young men in sacrament meeting on the back row that day had been fulfilled. They all returned to Alberta. They all lived their lives and were happy men. Nellie and Lowell had 6 children, but eventually those Alberta winters got to Nellie and she developed severe rheumatoid arthritis. One day she said to Lowell, "I feel if you will take me to the Cardston Temple, that there I will be blessed and healed from this pain." She could barely walk without assistance. Lowell heated bricks all night so that she could stay warm in the cold drive the next day. That day in the temple, Nellie did receive the blessing of being healed and was able to walk down the stairs of the temple herself, unassisted, and return to the car. On the way home, she barely spoke. The joy of that blessing and the miracle of being healed from that pain that had persisted her for so long was just almost overwhelming. I've included a picture of their 50th anniversary. I appreciate Jake Harmer sharing this book with me. I'm excited to get my book. I'll probably do an episode here in a few weeks when I get it. I hope you've enjoyed this story. We need more inspirational stories. We need to share these stories with our children and our posterity. You can subscribe to Sunshine for the Soul here. If you enjoyed this story, you'll probably enjoy this one. And you can listen to all of Sunshine for the Soul, Brother Merrill's stories right here. Thank you.